After week 11, there are some players that are skyrocketing up the fantasy rankings and a few that are falling down pretty quietly. So in this video, we'll be breaking down these 7 players who are currently rising and skyrocketing up the rankings. In one way or another, you need to get them on your team. And we'll start with the Bears wide receiver, Odunze, who benefited this past weekend from having a brand new play caller. That play caller for the Bears is Thomas Brown. He's the interim play caller for this offense after they fired some pieces on their staff last week. And in his first game with Thomas Brown as his offensive coordinator, Odunze comes out, he runs 90% of the routes. Okay, that's his typical role, but he earns a 32% target share. Not only was this a season high, it was the highest that any Bears wide receiver has seen in a game all season long. It was the 5th time this year that a Bears wide receiver hit at least a 30% target share, the 2nd time that Odunze didn't, but the first time he did it, Keenan Allen was out. This time was more impressive because Allen and DJ Moore were active and healthy. And what you got out of these 32% target share was 10 targets, 6 catches for 65 yards in a matchup against the Packers. 12.5 fantasy points is fine, but what I thought was more encouraging here was the overall usage for Odunze. He still continued to see some deep targets, but they went to him in key situations on the final drive of the game. This is an all 22 footage by Matt Waldman on Twitter. You can see Odunze is on the bottom here. This is a 4th down, the final potential play of the game if they don't convert here, and you're getting Caleb Williams going to Odunze, who makes a back shoulder reception for 21 yards. That was his 2nd completion on that final drive. He saw 4 deep targets in this game, which has kind of been what he's been seeing all season, a lot of downfield usage. But what I found even more encouraging is that he saw 6 short area targets, which when you're going to see a nice mixture of deep and short area targets, it will lead to even more consistency in your fantasy production moving forward. Odunze also led the team not only in targets, but with 53% of the team's air yards. That was the most that a Bears wide receiver has seen this season. So look, I know it's only one sample. It's only a 1-game sample for a wide receiver with a new play caller, so we can't take anything away from this. DJ Moore also saw great usage, but this is a young 22-year-old wide receiver, 1st-round pick that is trending in the right direction to end the year, while the older veteran in Keenan Allen isn't trending in that direction. So I do think he's separating himself a lot here. So this is good to see. I think it's a pretty clear cut now that it's DJ Moore and Odunze the rest of the season. I'll be curious to see if Odunze does outproduce DJ Moore the rest of the year, who saw some nice scheme production this past week with the new play caller. If you look at the upcoming schedule here, I mean, it's going to be a lot of divisional matchups against the Vikings, the Lions, the Vikings again. There's a chance that the Bears are trailing in a lot of these games if Caleb Williams continues to play well. If they add deception with Caleb Williams running the ball, maybe the offense just becomes more efficient, moves the ball downfield more. If that's the case, Odunze could operate as a maybe top 24 receiver week in and week out. So Odunze for me is now ranked as my 87th player the rest of the season. I view him pretty similar to like a Josh Downs right now at a similar position across different positions, like a Najee Harris and Bucking Irving, which kind of feels like maybe a little bit more than the market does. If your trade deadline is not passed, he's somebody that you can go out there and target for the cheap. Now this next guy won't be cheap, and you could have gotten him cheaper maybe a week or two ago, definitely before these past 2 weeks, but this guy is rising now to being a top 15 receiver rest of season. And that man's name is Jauan Jennings, who heading into week 11 was a top 24 wide receiver for me the rest of the year, and I felt like that was pretty aggressive compared to the market. Now he's easily inside my top 20 wide receivers rest of the year because as of right now, he's producing as the #1 receiver for the San Francisco 49ers. Yes, the #1 receiver ahead of Deebo Samuel the past 2 weeks, and really for the most part this season, Jennings has had at least 88 receiving yards in his last 4 completed games. As for Deebo, he's battling probably multiple injuries right now. They're kind of using him in a weird way at this point. He's getting used a lot around the line of scrimmage, which maybe has to do with that injury at this point. But right now, we can't ignore what Jennings is doing because he's coming off yet again another impressive performance where he led the team with 11 targets and his target share, where he ends up catching 10 balls, 91 yards, 6 targets on 3rd down, the key money downs where you trust your most consistent and best player. That's been Jennings the last 2 weeks. Finds the end zone, goes over 25 points for you. If you had a bad early window, he ends up going out there and playing in the 4 o'clock slate and just absolutely delivering for you. And Jennings has now played in 3 games without Brandon Ayuk or Deebo Samuel active this year. 2 without Ayuk, 1 without Deebo. In those contests, he's averaging 11.3 targets per game and 116 yards per game. And now he's coming off of back-to-back games where the target volume is elite. And this is with Deebo Samuel active and out there. A 33% target share, a 38% massive target share. He's out there as the X receiver for every single play. 95% of the routes, 94% of the routes. As I discussed earlier, he's getting all the targets on 3rd down right now. If we pull up Fantasy Life when we go over to that, 3rd and 4th down targets the last 2 weeks for Jennings, 3 in week 10, and in week 11 he gets 6. He's seen 9 targets on 3rd or 4th down this past 2 weeks. 9 targets by far leads the team, twice as many as anybody else, and that's where you're going to on the money downs in the NFL. The guy you trust the most, your X receiver, who's going to get you a bucket. It hasn't been Kittle. It definitely hasn't been Deebo. It's been Jauan Jennings. And for what it's worth, over these 3 games without Ayuk or Deebo this season, he's averaging an 82% catch rate, which would rank 3rd in the NFL this year. So as I start to finalize my rest of season rankings, which are being sent out to over 21,000 other people, you can still get a last chance chance at getting these tools and all my fantasy blueprint linked down below right now. As I'm finishing them right now, Jauan Jennings is a top 30 player, not at the position, rest of season for me. He's around my wide receiver 13 or 14 right now. I was going to put him behind DK Metcalf and Terry McLaurin, but I ended up putting him a tier above after running projections. Right now, there's very few wide receivers I want ahead of him. I still have Garrett Wilson, Drake London, Malik Neighbors, and then of course we get into the elite tier of wide receivers like Tyreek Hill, Puka Nacua, Cooper Kupp. But outside of that, top 30 wide receiver rest of season, Jauan Jennings. Every single week moving forward, this is a team that already had their bye week as well. That's important. Every week moving forward, he's in your lineup. You feel good at minimum 10 fantasy points with the upside of these 20+ point weeks. He is skyrocketing up the rankings right now. Hey, before we keep going in this video, I got to tell you about something I'm pretty excited about. And that's the NFL 2K Playmakers game. Now, let me explain. If you're a fan of football or just a fan of collecting sports-related stuff like me, you're probably going to love this. Because this NFL 2K Playmakers game is pretty similar to fantasy football in terms of it allows you to take control of their game as a coach or a manager. But it gets better. Because you could build your dream team, the exact team that you want, with hundreds of player cards. I'm talking real NFL players. Now, not only will you be able to assemble your squad like a fantasy manager, but you'll also be able to make the calls during the game to actually help your team win. It's like being on the field without actually having to be on the field. Now, the NFL 2K Playmakers has tons of modes you can play. They have the seasons mode, the red zone drive mode, and my personal favorite is the game changers mode. And the reason why that's my personal favorite game mode is because it's powered by real NFL stats. And like we do on this channel all the time, we break down stats, and now that analysis can help you with this Playmakers game. And if you're actually good at these game modes, you could even win some sweet in-game rewards to boost your squads even more. So far, to me, this game is so much fun. And trust me, we love watching our fantasy lineups on Sunday. This is just another add-on, another bonus, another thing we get to monitor while the games are on Sunday. So if you want even more things to be sweating on Sundays, go to the App Store or Google Play Store now and download NFL 2K Playmakers. And here's an additional gift for you beautiful people. You can get even more rewards when you use the code PlaymakerX. With this code, you'll get your shot at stars like Deebo Samuel, Lamar Jackson, Sauce Gardner, and so many more. So enter code PlaymakerX in the NFL 2K Playmakers app and unlock these exclusive rewards before it's too late. So a big thanks for the NFL 2K Playmakers for sponsoring this here video. Now let's get back into it. Now this next guy I want to talk about is actually a sell. I know this is a player about skyrocketing up the rankings, but one guy right now who is falling down, he's a major faller, is DeAndre Swift, which might seem crazy to you because this past week, once again, DeAndre Swift had a good game. He had 80 total yards between his rushing and receiving yards right here. He scores a touchdown, 16 plus fantasy points. He's now had at least 80 total yards in 6 out of his last 7 games and given you at least 14 fantasy points in 6 out of his last 7 games. He's been extremely consistent, a top 10 running back since week 4. All of that is great on the surface, but the problem is the new play caller, like we mentioned earlier, in Thomas Brown, he's going to affect whenever there's a new play caller, the offense gets shaken up, the players' roles get shaken up, and that's what happens in this Bears backfield in week 11. Because we already discussed what we saw in the offensive room, right? The wide receivers, Odunze saw more usage for the most part, though that could just be a one-week thing. When you're changing up your backfield, and we're going to talk about Roschon Johnson getting more involved in this backfield and Swift not being as involved, when you change up your backfield and actually take one player off the field to put another one on the field, that is deliberate. That is something that you are changing your entire offensive philosophy, and that's what we saw this past week with Roschon Johnson. The Bears' second-year running back goes out there, plays a season-high 44% of the snaps, sees 34% of the rush attempts, also a season high for Roschon Johnson. And keep in mind, Khalil Herbert is no longer on this team. Khalil Herbert was traded away to the Bengals, so Roschon has no other competition outside of Swift, and now he's taking some of those touches and snaps away from Swift. Because Swift in this game saw just 48% of the team's backfield carries, his second lowest on the season, his lowest number since week 3. He ends up losing the majority of the goal line and red zone work and all of the 2-minute offense snaps to Roschon Johnson this past week. That's a concern moving forward for Swift, who has a very tough schedule rest of season. At this point, it's probably difficult for you to trade Swift. Your trade deadline might be over, but he's my 60th player rest of season right now. Look, I'd just rather have other guys. Isaiah Pacheco coming back soon, even Darnell Mooney, who's banged up. Calvin Ridley, but not a good quarterback, but seeing all the volume there. Definitely J.K. Dobbins, definitely Tyron Tracy off of his bye week. All these guys over DeAndre Swift at this point. If you have Swift, with all the bye week, 6 teams on bye this week, you're probably forced to start him, but just temper your expectations. The next man up, and this guy is a definite riser, is Jaxon Smith-Njigba, who the last time we saw him before week 11, because he had his week 10 bye, was all the way back in week 9. And in week 9, he puts up a career day, has 180 yards, massive whopping 13 targets, 2 touchdowns in a nice matchup against the Rams, 40 fantasy points in PPR formats. He ended up being not only the highest scoring player at the position, the wide receiver 1 overall in week 9, but the highest scoring player in all of fantasy football that week. And it was nice because in that game, we got to see JSN, Jaxon Smith-Njigba, used a lot more downfield, which is not something we often see with his role. Now, of course, DK Metcalf was out in week 9. It was the second game that he missed with his knee injury, but he did return to the lineup in week 11. So how did this affect JSN? Well, honestly, not too much. His role continued to be great. He once again, even with Metcalf back, led the team with 11 targets in a somewhat tough matchup against the 49ers 49ers, who have a top 5 secondary on the season in coverage grades, according to PFF, and he goes for 10 catches, 100 yards yet again, goes for 25 fantasy points, once again finishes as a top 10, top 5 wide receiver at the position, and this is what DK Metcalf back. Now, of course, with DK back, some of that downfield usage went back to DK and away from Jaxon Smith-Njigba, but it didn't all get evaporated. Because as you can see right here on this target, middle of the field for JSN, this is his first target of the game, middle of the field crossing route, 20 yards downfield. That's a deep target. So like right away, they were like, we saw what you did in week 9. We're going to go right back to you. So he was able to do that last week. He saw another deep target in that game as well. If we just get 2 to 3 deep targets a game for JSN and this increased volume that he's separating himself from Tyler Lockett, that's all we need to see. So JSN for me was somebody who just skyrocketed up the rankings. He's my 62nd overall player. I have him next to guys like Brian Thomas, DeAndre Hopkins, which is just a tier below some really strong wide receiver names like Jaden Reed, like Ladd McConkey, like Devonta Smith. He's really rising up the rankings. And if this usage continues for just one more week, he'll be a top 50 player rest of season. He's a weekly starter for you right now instead of a maybe flex or bench option, especially with the bye weeks. The guy's skyrocketing up the rankings. And another guy who's skyrocketing up the rankings is a quarterback who is available as of this recording before the waivers clear in over 50% of fantasy leagues still, and that is Anthony Richardson, who this past week was a top 10 graded passer according to PFF, ahead of names like Justin Herbert, who had a great game, Mahomes, heck, even Joe Burrow. He was ahead of all those guys based on his play. Because Anthony Richardson came out in his first game back in a good matchup, mind you, against the Jets, who have been bad this year. He completes 20 of 30 attempts, so 20 attempts for just the second time in his career, he completed 20 passes. And out of these attempts, 2 of them were dropped, 1 was a throwaway, so he was really 20 of 27 in this game. Overall here, this ends up him completing 66% of his passes. His true completion percentage was over 70%, which was top 5 on the week, which is crazy considering he had a historically bad 45% completion percentage on the year before this game. So this is steps in the right direction for sure. And then you look at not only his completion percentage, but his overall efficiency. And he's averaging 9.1 yards per attempt. We know he has the big arm. We know he likes to throw downfield. He completed 2 of 4 balls of 20 plus yards downfield in this game. It was the perfect Anthony Richardson experience. You got the 272 passing yards and a touchdown. If you're a fantasy manager, you really love the 10 carries for 30 plus yards here on the ground and 2 touchdowns. He goes for 30 fantasy points. Like, it's not going to be like this every week. We know that for a fact. You're not going to get these great, almost flawless performances from Richardson. He missed 1 or 2 throws in this game, but for the most part, it was awesome. Some weeks we're still going to get below 200 passing yards. So we could take that and we can accept that because we've now seen the upside. This was probably the best game he's played, not just all year, in his entire career. And the biggest piece of news here is now we could feel confident, not just about Richardson himself, if you've had him on your team or you were able to pick him up moving forward, he can definitely be a starter for you, especially with the bye weeks, but with his other pass catchers. You get Josh Downs for 84 yards and a touchdown in this game, catching all 100% of his passes. You get, once again, Michael Pittman has been dealing with this back injury, leads the team with 8 targets, a 5-catch, 46-yard day. Okay, that's fine overall. We like to see, especially if there's more volume in future weeks, we like to see that he's getting involved. Alec Pierce, heck, he remains involved with a 74-yard game, continues to see an explosive play. So the pass catchers are remaining involved on this offense. That's the biggest thing here. Sure, you might be somebody who's starting Richardson, but as long as we can feel comfortable in Josh Downs and heck, get something and get some back-to-life play out of Michael Pittman, this is good news. The one person who lost out the most here this week was Jonathan Taylor, who despite seeing 25 touches, didn't even crack 50 total or 60 total yards in this game he hits. He only gets 57 rushing yards, was highly inefficient. And of course, when you see Anthony Richardson for 2 rushing touchdowns, those are taken away from Jonathan Taylor. So you might be panicking if you're a Jonathan Taylor manager this year, but don't. Look, the offense looked better, much better overall. That's something good moving forward. Taylor's still running behind a top 3 offensive line in the run blocking game right now. He's still seeing, like we saw, 25 touches. He'll have more efficient weeks, and Anthony Richardson isn't going to see all the rushing touchdowns moving forward. Now, the next guy we got to talk about is a wide receiver with some cautious optimism here, and this is Brian Thomas. Brian Thomas, look, I don't feel good about saying this, but I ended up watching all 29 of Mac Jones' pass attempts yesterday, watching back to film to see what he was doing. And let me just tell you, it was an awful time watching Mac Jones. It is not fun watching a guy averaging less than 5 yards per pass attempt, not being able to complete downfield throws. But the one thing that was working was Brian Thomas. Because Brian Thomas in this game, he ends up seeing 7 targets, his most targets in over a month of the season. He catches 5 of them for 82 yards, gets a carry for 4 yards in this game. And yes, it was a blowout. They were trailing by so many scores, by like 6 scores at one point against the Detroit Lions, even more than that maybe. But in most weeks, there is going to be blowout run. That's how bad this Jags offense and more importantly, their defense is. So 13.6 fantasy points was strong for Brian Thomas, but what was even better for me, I was concerned that all season long, we're just going to see Brian Thomas continuing to run go routes and Mac Jones not be able to complete those. They changed his usage in week 11. We got a lot more short to intermediate targets, especially in the middle of the field. Here's his first deep reception of the game. It wasn't even a deep catch. It was like 15 yards downfield. He's in the middle of the field right here. That goes for about 20 plus yards of a gain. Okay, that was probably like the most challenging throw for Mac Jones, a middle of the field with some space to work with. But these next 2 were really encouraging for Brian Thomas. The first one is right here. Brian Thomas is in the slot. He's just going to do a very simple crossing route over the middle of the field right here. There's a lot of time. Mac Jones extends the play. It only goes for like a 10-yard gain. Yards after the catch, it goes for 20-plus yards for Brian Thomas. That's good. Then we see a very similar play. It's almost like a check down to the running back right here. Brian Thomas at the top of the screen comes out of the backfield across the formation. He gets an easy check down. He takes it after the catch for, again, this is another 20-yard gain. There was one or two other plays in this game where he caught and ran for short yardages for like 20 to 30 yards over the middle of the field. Look, that's what we need to see. He's not going to get big completions from Mac Jones downfield if Jones continues to be the quarterback. We need to see him being schemed on the underneath stuff. That's what we saw in week 11. That's encouraging. What's also encouraging is that this report right here for SportsMD Analysis, a Harvard-trained surgeon, a sports surgeon, he says that Trevor Lawrence has his bye in week 12. So does Brian Thomas, so he's not going to be able to be playable for you this week. But given that his injury, Lawrence, is to his non-throwing shoulder, he suspects, SportsMD Analysis, Deepak here, that week 13 is a target date for Trevor Lawrence with no major dip in passing production. That's the biggest piece of the puzzle here for Brian Thomas. If you tell me Mac Jones is the starter the rest of the season, of course I don't feel good about that. Now, I do like the change in the role and that they put him in different spots to win, but we need Trevor Lawrence back because that's when we can start to see Brian Thomas operate as a top 24 rest of season receiver. So Brian Thomas for me right now is my number 63 player overall. He's right around JSN, right around Hopkins. I think this is a fair spot for him until we know for sure that Trevor Lawrence is the quarterback the rest of the season and does return. If that's the case, he would start to bump up in this range right here as a top 50 player for me. Around Devonta Smith, Devonta Adams, and Ladd McConkey, I would view him as that tier of player. Has really no target competition on the outside with both Gabe Davis now done for the year, Christian Kirk done for the year, and just in general, he has the talent level to win at all levels of the field. And Brian Thomas, he just needs the quarterback to be playing well. Now, the next guy we got to talk about is somebody who is a faller. Another faller like DeAndre Swift here is Mark Andrews, who had the best usage of his entire season and in a very long time, probably a year and a half to 2 years, back in week 10. In week 10, according to Fantasy Life, Andrews ran 94% of the routes, which is insane. That's like elite wide receiver usage. You can see in the previous weeks, just 50 and 74%. This led to 22% of the targets. He earned a season high 7 targets in this game. He earned a season high 6 catches in this game. He goes for 18.8 fantasy points, finishing as a top 5 tight end on the week. And then he enters week 11 after this nice performance with 4 top 12 finishes at the position the past 5 weeks. So he's trending in the right direction, right? However, the reason why Andrews saw an increased role in routes run in week 10 on Thursday Night Football against the Bengals was because Isaiah Likely with a hamstring was kind of a surprise inactive and scratched. There wasn't a lot of news about the hamstring until Thursday when he was ruled out for the most part. Not a lot of updates there. So Likely's out. We get Andrews seeing more work, but heading into week 11, since this wasn't a major injury for Likely, he returns and Andrews' usage took a hit. And you can see right here, once again on Fantasy Life, week 10, he had that 94% route rate on the field for every play. Week 11, it drops to 58%, which cuts not only his routes in half, but his targets to just 11%. Andrews in this game sees just 3 targets. A measly 3 targets, 2 catches for 22 yards. Isaiah Likely returns, goes back to his normal role of playing over 50% of the snaps and just being involved enough to cap Mark Andrews' floor and upside in fantasy. Andrews now goes from being like a weekly top 10 tight end, he's definitely in your lineups, to somebody you can't even trust. Like at this point, I would definitely be dropping Mark Andrews, or maybe you put him on your roster, but I'd rather be starting heading forward Will Dissly and Jonnu Smith. Based on this usage with Likely back, Andrews goes to being outside my top 100 overall players rest of season. So if we were to scroll up overall, I'd rather have Dallas Goedert, who's been dealing with his own injuries. Heck, even Sam Laporta, who's been probably the biggest bust in all of fantasy this year. I'd rather have Evan Ingram, who continues to see 6, 7, 8 plus targets a game despite a poor offense and quarterback situation with the Jaguars. All those guys over Mark Andrews, who at this point, Mark Andrews to me, if he doesn't score a touchdown, more weeks than not is only going to get you 2 or 3 catches for 20 or 30 yards like we saw in week 11. Now, if you are curious what this tool is right here, we've been showing it all season long. It's my rest of season rankings, my trades tool. If your trade deadline has not passed, you can get this along with all of my other tools, my weekly rankings and projections, game-by-game matchup notes, and a whole lot more. The QR code will be on the screen for the fantasy blueprint. This is the final week. I extended it by 1 week because some people had some issues getting onto the site. So final week to get the fantasy blueprint the rest of the season. If you don't make your fantasy playoffs, you get the one-time payment of $10 sent right back to you. All the rules and how to get it are linked up right here. Thank you so much for tuning into this video. If you want to see the players, the running back stashes heading into your fantasy postseason, the guys that you should have on your bench just stashed in case something happens to the starter over like some crappy wide receivers or backup quarterbacks and tight ends, well, check out this video. It's popping up right here. The running back stashes, and earlier the week, the overall wide receiver ads. See if any of those guys are still hanging around on your waiver wire. Appreciate you all tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.